So, welcome everyone to our latest Exeter Tehran conversation on philosophy in Iran. And today we'll be talking about ethics and possibly also meta-ethics. And it's a real pleasure to have as our guest Dr. Muhammad Legenhausen, who I think I first met back in 96 or 97 perhaps in Qom all those years ago. And we've met intermittently since then. I will pass over to Mohsen to say a bit more and get the conversation going. But just to start by saying that Dr. Legenhausen has a PhD from Rice University from 1983. And he's been associated with various kinds of hybrid institutions and institutes for the study of philosophy in Iran since 1991, particularly the Muassasa Imam Khomeini Institute of Imam Khomeini Institute for I think it's Education and Research is the title.
That's right.
Yes.
Yep.
And he has also for the last 10 years been teaching ethics at the University of Qom. So in many ways, he's very much, the ideal person for us to have precisely this sort of discussion about the study and research and teaching of ethics in the Iranian context. So Dr. Legenhausen, welcome to you and welcome to everyone who's joined us. And maybe I will kick it off and not give it to Mohsen first, but I think it might be useful if we start by asking you how it was that you came to philosophy, and also how did you come to be interested in being involved in the study of philosophy and ethics in Iran.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. My story of philosophy is somewhat unusual because I came to philosophy at a very young age. I was 11 years old and watching cartoons on TV. And somebody started making fun of philosophy. And I went to my mother and I said, what's philosophy? They're talking about it on the cartoon show. And she said, well, there's a library 3 blocks away, go to the library and find out. So I went to the library and I picked up a book called Types of Philosophy by William Ernest Hocking. And I just loved that book. And I decided before I finished reading the entire text that I wanted to study philosophy. And I've been studying philosophy then since I was 11 years old, actually.
That raises a really interesting question, which maybe we can discuss later. But how you get kids interested in philosophy, and really how we should be teaching philosophy in schools. I don't know what the situation is in Iran is, but maybe we can discuss that later. Certainly in our context in Britain, it's like our anti-intellectualism is of a different scale. So we definitely don't encourage things like philosophy at school.
The other thing you asked was about teaching in Iran. In 1989, I decided that I was teaching at Texas Southern University in Houston, and I had some friends who were able to get me an invitation to come to Iran. And by that time, I had converted to Islam, but I didn't know anything about Islamic philosophy except a couple of books I read. So I thought it would be good to spend a year or maybe 2 years and study Islamic philosophy in Iran. So after waiting almost a year, I finally got a visa and invitation, and I went to the Anjuman Hikmat fa Falsafe, the Academy of Philosophy in Tehran. And actually, one of the first courses I taught there was also in ethics. I taught ethics and philosophy of religion and epistemology there. And but after a year in Tehran, I realized that although I had studied Persian and Arabic before I left, I was really weak in both languages. And so after the first year I was there, I decided to spend another year, and then another. And then the fourth year I was there, I met my wife, and that changed everything. And I decided that instead of trying to be an expert on Islamic stuff, I would teach Western philosophy in Iran.
Thank you. That's very useful. Over to you, Mohsen.
Okay, thank you, Professor Legenhausen, for being here. I think it would be useful to start with your teaching experience at the Iranian Institute of Philosophy. I mean, at the present, speaking of ethics in Iran, at the present, ethics is a subfield in philosophy which has gained considerable attention. But my impression is that it is somehow new, and that the focus on moral philosophy is by and large new to the Iranian academy. I mean, in comparison to other fields of philosophy, moral philosophy has gained a relatively new attention in philosophy departments. Yeah, apart from the ethical debates within the tradition of Islamic philosophy, the first encounters with and translations of the Western moral philosophy is related to epistemology, philosophy of science, philosophy of religion, and so on and so forth. And I think it is only within the past 15 years or so that moral philosophy has come to the fore. Is it the case? And if so, how would you explain it? I think your teaching experience at the Iranian Institute of Philosophy at that time would be a very useful observation about this. As far as I heard, and you mentioned that you were teaching epistemology, ethics, and philosophy of religion. How was the receptions of those teachings, and have these fields gained same attention at that time, or was there some difference in receiving those fields?
No, all the lectures that I gave at the academy were very well received. The people who attended my lectures were all professors at the academy. Dr. Avani was the president of the academy at the time, and arranged, not only did he arrange for me to give these lectures there, but he also gave me private lessons in Islamic philosophy the whole 4 years that I was in the academy. The reaction to ethics, philosophy, well, let me explain it this way. When I started teaching philosophy of religion, there were people who had no idea, even among the professors, of what philosophy of religion was. Is it theology? If it's not theology, what are the discussions that they have? And I would tell them, well, talks about the proofs for the existence of God, the attributes of God, the problem of evil, things like that. They said, we have that. That's kalam. That's nothing new, And likewise, when I started teaching ethics, there was also some questioning about whether moral philosophy, as it's understood in the West, is the same as ilm akhlaq. And there are differences. And the issue of the relationship between ethics or moral philosophy and religion was also a question that came up oftentimes. People wanted to know, well, for example, I remember there was one scholar who attended some of my lectures, and he said, look, everything that we're supposed to do and not to do, we have it in fiqh. So what is ethics doing? Is ethics telling us something that we already know that we should do? Or is it telling us not to do what fiqh tells us to do? If it's telling us not to do what fiqh tells us, then we should get rid of it. And if it's just confirming it, well, then, it's okay. And then somebody else said to me, well, it seems, after attending some lectures, he said to me, it seems that this ethics of yours is just mustahabat. It's just some extra kind of stuff, it's not what you need to keep out of hell. It's just a kind of making your soul more beautiful, as it were. But that was just a couple of initial reactions, but which were kind of weird. But for the most part, people were very much interested. And since that time, when I started, when I was in Tehran, the interest in moral philosophy, Western moral philosophy, has grown tremendously. At the same time that this is going on, there's also been a huge explosion of interest in traditional ethics in the Islamic tradition. So prior to the revolution, there were a few people who were giving lectures on ethics, practical ethics, based on traditional sources. But this was rather limited. With the work of Ayatollah Misbah Yazdi, there was a lot of focus on ethics, particularly because of his Akhlaq dar Quran, where he goes through the Quran, trying to say that the main message that the Quran is telling us is how to build ourselves morally. So it's true, yes, we have these questions of worship and what's haram and what's wajib and all of these kind of things that's in there too. But the ethics is certainly not of less importance. So I would say that another book by Ayatollah Misbah was called Khudsazi, or Self-Building, which became extremely popular, and it's now widely used in the Jose. So, and then since Ayatollah Misbah, other people in the Jose have also taken the question of ethics from traditional point of view very seriously, and have started promoting this. So this is going on at the same time that young people, professors in the university, are starting to study Western moral philosophy. So it's a really interesting, dynamic atmosphere for studying ethics in Iran, because you have these two movements. I mean, usually we think of the Islamic stuff and what's going on in the Jose as they're saying the old traditional things. But from within the Jose, the study of ethics after the revolution was a new thing, that they were spending more attention on ethics, whereas prior to that, the attention was mostly on fiqh and usul, but now ethics was gaining a lot of attention. And so for this new movement in the Jose, in the Islamic seminaries, to be happening at the same time as people started reading and discussing and translating works of Western moral philosophy, it made for a very interesting dynamic. And this is something that's continuing today as well.
Can I just ask one kind of follow-up on that, which is, in a lot of our conversations, we've been talking about political context being quite important. And it seems that this kind of new Hawzavi discovery of akhlaq as a sort of an ethics of Islam is very much a post-revolutionary phenomenon, which arises out of that context, right? And of course, it's based on one simple kind of classic historical problem, which is that if one wants to look for ethics or moral philosophy within the tradition in a long sort of in the long durée of philosophical works, as opposed to works which describe themselves as akhlaq, then the tradition seems to be rather bare, right? So if you want to go back to the great thinkers, there's not a huge amount in their works which is devoted to ethics. But of course, there is the akhlaq literature, which comes, especially the Nasiruddin Tusi tradition. And of course, there are works like, Jamia Sa'adat of Naraqi, which, remains a very important work. So I guess it seems that this is a shift, which is more kind of, well, let's see what an ethics would be by going back to, say, maybe foundational texts and making a sort of philosophical, ethical sense of those foundational texts, as opposed to just engaging as, for example, metaphysics, you just maybe talk about Avicenna's positions or Mullah Sadr's positions, but this seems to be something different.
Yeah, I agree. And, you're mentioning the political issues is also very apropos in this regard. Within the Jose, there was also a realization that they didn't have a whole lot of political philosophy in their tradition. So there was there's been a great attempt made since the revolution to try different approaches towards the development of an Islamic political philosophy. And so, for example, some people are promoting a political fiqh. So they say we should just use the methods that have been developed in fiqh and usul, but in the past, they've been directed just towards questions about worship and inheritance and things like this. We should apply those same methods to try to find rulings on political issues. So that's one approach. Another approach has been, well, let's go and reread the philosophical tradition and pull out the stuff that we can find on politics and develop that more. And another approach was, look, we have political thinkers in the contemporary Islamic world, people like Imam Khomeini and Shahid Motahari and Shahid Sadr and others have political writings, so we should pay more attention to them and try to develop an Islamic political philosophy out of those. And I think you can find a similar thing going on with respect to ethics. So there's this approach that, well, for example, Ayatollah Misbah was saying, well, we should go back to the Quran, look at our basic sources and reread them for their ethical content. But I know of other scholars who are saying, yeah, that's all fine and good, but we also need to pay more attention to Miskawayh and the whole ethics tradition in Islamic philosophy. And there's plenty in that we can use and develop more. Within the people who are interested in Irfan have also gotten very excited about this movement in ethics. Somewhere, Shahid is that and Irfan are really doing the same thing, except that Irfan tells you practically how to go stage by stage. But it's really trying to develop the same, it has the same kind of goal that ethics does. So there's also this Irfani approach to rereading the Irfani tradition with an emphasis on ethical teachings. So there's this, and there's also this idea of the this whole big issue about the relation between ethics and fiqh, which continues to engage a lot of people.
Well, speaking of the latest issue, I mean, the relation between fiqh and ethics, I think it is another kind of putting the traditions into conversation other than working with the traditional text in ethics. And this has been one of the trends in the study of ethics within the last years in Iran, as far as I remember or understand it. It is not surprising that not one of the few, or if not only, the department of ethics is in Qom, in the University of Qom, and there is a growing interest in the study of ethics in Hausa. Let me ask this: if do you think if and how the two parallel traditions, I mean the stuff in fiqh, or especially in usul fiqh, have been in conversation, or put it normatively, how can the two traditions get into conversation with each other? I mean, the fiqh tradition and the Western ethical tradition, so to speak.
It's really complex, and it's even more complex than you suggest, and that's already complex enough, because what you have to negotiate is not just Western moral theory and fiqh, but also the ethical tradition within Islam and fiqh, and this stuff that we find in the Western tradition as well. So there's also been a interest in going back. For example, Dr. Mohsen Javadi has been teaching the Nicomachean ethics now for, I don't know, over a year, going through it slowly with a group of students. And there's a lot of people who are interested in trying to go back to common roots between the Western tradition and Islamic ethical tradition, to try to develop a new approach to this. But with respect specifically to how fiqh can interact with this, there are lots and lots of very different views about this that are being argued about now. So there's one kind of idea that some people have, is that, look, ethics is about your personal character. It's about trying to acquire virtue. And this is ethics in the Aristotelian tradition. So it doesn't really have anything to do with fiqh. Fiqh is about specific actions. What can I eat? What can't I eat? When I want to pray, what should I do? If I want to give money or take money, if I want to say prayers, if I want to get married, what should I do? All my interactions with other people are governed by the laws that are studied in fiqh. What fiqh does not tell you to do is how to be courageous, how to be just, how to be noble. This is something that you learn in ethics. Okay, this is the traditional understanding. So in practical philosophy consisted of politics, household management, and ethics. Ethics was concerned with acquiring virtue and getting rid of vices if you have them. Oftentimes it was looked at on a model of health. So somebody who is healthy in spirit would have the virtues, and when you get sick in your spirit, you get these vices, and there are different prescriptions that the ethicist would give you to remove your vices. So with that kind of approach, it seems like there's no room for conflict between fiqh and ethics. But this kind of view is, what can I say? It's like going out of style. People's understanding of ethics, even people who grow up in studying in the Jose, their understanding of ethics is much broader than what you find in the ancient tradition. So they understand ethics as telling me that various kinds of actions are morally wrong. Now, here, if ethics is telling me about specific actions and saying what's right and wrong, then there's an opportunity for there to be a conflict with what fiqh says. And when there's a conflict, what should we do? Should we throw out ethics entirely? How can ethics have anything to say about specific moral rulings about what action to perform or not to perform when it's also covered in fiqh? This is a big question. Now, one approach, and there are various approaches to how to reconcile these. One approach that a number of young fuqaha have taken up is to say that, well, ethics should be like a filter. So when we want to make a ruling in fiqh about what Islamic law says, it can't say anything that's against what morality teaches us. So we have to first look at what morality says and interpret our sources on the basis of that so that we don't give any rulings that are contrary to morality. Now, which morality and what are the standards that are used and how do you get moral knowledge? All these kind of questions come up, and just as in contemporary meta-ethics in the West, there are different ideas about how to answer these kind of things. I'll give you a good example. Is one of the colleagues who teaches at Mufid University is Abul Qasim Fanai. And he's published work that uses a ideal observer kind of meta-ethics and argues that all of our rulings in fiqh have to be kind of screened in accordance with whether they accord with what the ideal observer would say is the right thing to do in these circumstances. So you can never have a ruling in fiqh that would contradict ethics. But that's just the one approach. Other people would say that no, what you have to do is balance these things. What we have to do is one of the main factors that motivates more conservative and traditionalist attitudes towards ethics is skepticism. So the more conservative people will say, you say that slavery is morally impermissible, for example. How do you know that slavery is morally impermissible? I mean, if somebody was really nice to their slaves and really treated them well, and the slave was only somebody who was captured in war and would be in prison for life otherwise, isn't it better to have the institute of slavery? How do you know that this system of morality that you've gotten from the West is better than a proper moral interpretation of Islam? So what I found is those who are eager to defend traditional understanding of fiqh and Sharia, when attacked from people who are bringing up moral arguments against some of the rulings, will generally respond by saying that, look, for our ruling in fiqh, we have a whole methodology. The reason why I know that, for example, slavery is permitted is because we have lots of narrations, and there's mention in the Quran about this as well. So if I have a slave and I die and come before God on the day of resurrection, I have a good excuse for it. Hey, God, if you didn't want me to have a slave, why didn't you put it in your book or tell the Masumins to tell us about this? That's this kind of attitude or reaction that's given. Other people say, the ones who want to say, no, slavery, oh, that's terrible. We have to reform our fiqh so that we don't allow for this kind of thing. They say that, well, no, we can develop a moral epistemology, but again, how to do, there's no agreement about exactly how to do this, but we can develop a moral epistemology. And on the basis of this moral epistemology, we need to certainly reform many of the rulings that traditionally you find in the books of fiqh. So a good example of this is Muhammad Damad. Muhammad Damad is a scholar, philosopher, PhD, and he's been very, very much outspoken in the Jose to push for human rights. And he's called publicly upon the Madaraj Taqlid to change the rulings that conflict with human rights so as to protect human rights. Now, within the Jose, most people think that he's going rather too far. It's because it would require changing lots and lots of things. And who's supposed to determine what human rights are? It's not the UN. So where does it come from? And how are we supposed to develop reliable views about this? So again, the question of skepticism arises here. of how can we gain moral knowledge that's firm enough that it can be used to justify the kind of reform that somebody like Muhammad Legenhausen is calling for.
And I think you've quite nicely touched upon something which actually came up in our discussion on philosophy of science, which is that within the context of philosophy of science, there's quite a lot of scope for consideration of applied ethics. So, how does, say, a physician behave? How does an engineer behave, and so forth? And how do you think of the moral consequences, perhaps, of one's actions within the field of science and technology? But above and beyond that, it seems that with the particular problem you're raising, I would be surprised that there are very many people who are trained usulis in Qom who would have a problem with the idea of a moral epistemology to work out whether something is rationally good or bad in and of itself, because that's very much part of the tradition. The question is, how do you determine that? And it seems that there are a number of different ways in which you might do that. So one, very common way of trying to deal with this in modern Islam, whether Sunni or Shia, increasingly even Shia, is the whole framework of maqasid al-sharia and the whole idea of maslaha and mafsada. So you basically have this wider notion of certain ethical goals, rational purposiveness of law as an ethical frame. And so if you keep those kind of supreme values in mind, then that could be one way you could do it. Another way, of course, you could do it with respect to rights, and this brings me to someone like Allama Tabatabai, is Allama Tabatabai's notion of fitrat. Yeah, so his concept of fitrat as something which is kind of basic and which is not necessarily what you might call naturalism, of course, in modern kind of philosophical jargon, but it's a certain kind of naturalism, which raises this whole question of what are the features of that fitrat? What is inalienable in terms of what the hukuk that fitrat has? And then I guess another kind of possible way you could do it, again following from Allama Tabatabai, is making this classic distinction that he makes between things which are haqiqi and things which are i'tibari. And so, if given that he would say that many things in the realm of the laws, or the positive law as we have it, are constructed, they're socially constructed in a particular way. There is no reason why we need to stick with them, right? That's it. They're not metaphysical realities. So, for example, if there is a particular hukum on, say, slavery or whatever, or on, let's say, classic issues of contention like the rights of women, inheritance, family law, etc., then these are not haqiqi issues. These are not metaphysically true, but rather they're socially constructed. And so if they're socially constructed, then they need to follow the social norms, perhaps, or as they develop. I'm assuming these are precisely the sorts of arguments which are going on.
That's right.
Yeah.
Absolutely, but it's all very contentious because Allame, in precisely where he talks about the etibariyat in Al-Mizan, he's criticizing the Marxists because the Marxists hold that the fitrat can change. And he argues that the law can be the same for thousands of years because the fitrat doesn't change. So his ideas can also be employed by conservatives to say that, well, this idea that things are going to change now because human nature changes, comes from the West. That's not from the Islamic tradition. But there are also, I think, lots of people right now who take quite the other line as well. and who are saying, well, I'll give you another example. I have a friend whose main thesis is that a large percent of what we know about what's right and wrong, as it's mentioned in the Quran, is an appeal to what people generally know to be right and wrong. So when a zulm is condemned, there's no definition given for zulm, for oppression. You're supposed to understand, everybody knows what oppression is. But this knowledge, this Urfi knowledge, as it were, the knowledge that's common among the people about moral terms, this changes from time to time. And so our rulings in fiqh should reflect those changes in what good and bad is understood as among the common people.
Great, that's a fruitful conversation. But let me turn to a more concrete question. Let me change the debate and ask about the situation, the relation between ethics and what is done in ethics in Iran in relation to other fields of philosophy, for example. I mean, maybe is it the case that most of what is done in terms of ethics is done within the tradition of analytic philosophy, or is there any other connections with in ethics with other traditions in philosophy? Or I would like to know more about this.
Most of my students have not studied a lot of analytic philosophy. So most of the students that I meet at the university have studied what's generally called continental philosophy. They have some kind of background about existentialism, and they've read some Heidegger or something like this, but very little analytic philosophy. But most of the material that's being translated into Persian from Western moral philosophy is coming out of the analytic tradition. So this also creates an interesting, I don't want to say tension, but lack of cohesion, because the people who are studying these newly translated works in moral philosophy don't have the background generally. I mean, there are plenty of exceptions, but in general, most of the students don't have the background in analytic discussions of epistemology that are often assumed in the meta-ethical literature.
So what sort of works are we talking about in terms of those that have been translated from the analytic tradition?
There was recently there's a book by Lawrence Hinman just called Ethics, which has been translated by our colleagues at the Ethics House in Rome. And I wouldn't really say that Hinman is working from a strictly analytic perspective, but in a broad sense, he's working within the analytic tradition. And I think Hinman's book is fairly representative of the kind of thing that that people are looking at. After Virtue by McIntyre was a work that was translated into Persian some years ago, which has had considerable influence and attention drawn to it. And McIntyre is an interesting character because although he's working within this broadly analytic tradition. He also draws on the Marxist tradition as well, and all sorts of other things. So in a way, I think MacIntyre is really a good person for people to read in Iran, just because he's a little bit broader than people who are coming out of a very strictly analytic tradition.
He is also translated in Persian.
Yeah, that's what I said, after Virtue. And now 3 rival versions has also been translated.
By Hamid Shahriyari, if I'm right.
Yeah.
I mean, there's also, I mean, one thing which I'm familiar with, although I don't know if they've been translated, is the sort of interest in the work of people like Robert Adams, maybe even some of the kind of works which I guess go into religious ethics, Marilyn Adams as well, those who work in virtue ethics like Elizabeth Hartshorne and stuff like that. So it seems that a lot of these, I guess, are of relevance because they're very closely related to ethical issues within a religious context, and also because they're very much within this tradition of virtue ethics, which coheres quite nicely with the kind of the Hikmat traditions.
That's right.
Yeah.
So there's been a really tremendous, you know, when people here start studying modern Western ethics, they want to find something that they can get a handle on, and that can be interestingly compared with what they're more familiar with. And they find that in people who are working in a broadly Aristotelian tradition, people who are focusing on virtue ethics. But for somebody who's completely working in a Kantian tradition, for example, it would be much more difficult. But there are. One of my colleagues at the University of Qom is Ayatollah Shahrudi, not the one in the who was in the judiciary, but another Shahrudi, and he published a book on ethical theory, which is for the most part, we could say it's an Islamicized Kantianism. I mean, he takes a very deontological approach to ethical issues and tries to show that through reason, we can come to specific rulings, very much in the Kantian tradition. So, although the Aristotelian tradition is more immediately attractive to people for obvious reasons, it's not. You shouldn't be surprised to see people drawing on other traditions, even people trained in the Jose, drawing on Kantian or other traditions to develop their own ethical theories.
And actually, just to connect to our last conversation, I mean, it seems that a lot of these works, these conceptions are predicated on the idea of a universal self, or even a universal kind of character. So is there any evidence of things like feminist ethics and other kinds of traditions starting the critiques that, you know, starting to penetrate places like Qom or others? Or would that just really kind of be resisted?
No, there's been some attention given to feminist philosophies, but I haven't seen a lot of this specifically in the area of ethics. But it's coming. I mean, I'm sure this is this is something that's on the way. People like Barbara Herman and works that deal with the emotions have attracted a certain amount of attention. There are also a lot of people who are interested in connecting ethical issues with questions of moral education. And with respect to questions of moral education, critiques of this unified self or universal self also become more more pronounced.
Okay, I think we should probably open up to others who'd like to ask questions. I have some more, and I'm sure Mohsen has some, but I think we should give others a chance. I'm sure people have. Does anyone have any questions? Mansoor, do you have a question? Yes? Okay, let's start with you. Please go ahead.
Yes. Thank you very much for your very interesting presentation, very enriching and useful. I have a question. You already talked about it a little bit, but it is very interesting for me, the conflict between fiqh and ethics, or perhaps philosophy of ethics. You talked about your colleague Abul Qasim Thanai and the book he wrote, and he tried to find ethical fundament for fiqh. Is this approach sort of like accepted movement in Qom especially, and especially after the revolution, these developing interest in moral philosophy of ethics, is it sort of challenging for fiqh, and had it sort of questioned the centrality of fiqh in this Islamic thought? Because I always find it very strange, to be honest, that fiqh in Islamic thought has the highest position. It is like, for example, in Europe, you put the law very above everything, and the jurists, they determined what the poet should write, or what the philosopher is allowed to talk about, or artist, or I don't know, every other branches, literature and so on. Everything should be determined or be allowed by the law. It is very strange picture for me, but I think it is still so in Islamic thought. And I asked myself if this picture of Islamic spirit have been questioned by the how should I say, the mullahs, the rohanis in Qom itself, if there is a serious movement against this relationship between different disciplines in Islamic spirit.
Well, the predominance of fiqh in Islam has its own history. And so it's not something that you should really be surprised at. I mean, if we look at the history of Islamic civilization, and especially the role that the clergy has played, both among Sunnis and Shia, it's really not surprising to see that the law has come to play a predominant, has come to have this predominant role. In that respect, it's similar to Judaism. I mean, if we look at Judaism and Christianity in comparison to Islam, both Judaism and Islam are more focused on law, whereas Christianity is more focused on having the right beliefs. Now, of course, Christianity also has its own laws, moral laws, and canon laws, and Judaism and Islam also have their own ethics, but the emphasis in Judaism and Islam has always been on the law. So when people like Fana'i, Dr. Fana'i, and others suggest that the law needs to be reformed, of course this provokes opposition and outrage among some people. I mean, what are they doing? You can't change this. The law that the Prophet brought is the law forever, and all of this kind of stuff. But at the same time, there's a lot of younger scholars, not to mention professors and students at the university, who welcome this kind of rethinking of what the law should be. But you're raising, I think, a really interesting question, and that is, should Islamic law be playing the focal role that it has in the Jose today? And here too, it seems to me, in my experience, this is also something that's being questioned. It used to be, I mean, the previous generation, or the generation that grew up in the Jose prior to the revolution, it was all about fiqh and usul. I mean, that's the main thing. And it's still, in most of the Jose, the reason why you go to the Jose is so that you can become a faqih. It's not so that you can become a philosopher or a preacher or an ethicist or something like this. You want to become somebody who achieves the degree of ijtihad and is able to determine for themselves what God wants from us. But I think this is changing. Lots of the young talibés who I speak with, while they respect the law and they think that it's very important to learn the tradition, I find in a lot of them that's not really what turns them on. That's not the focus of their own religious life. Their own religious life is much more involved with social issues, moral issues, questions, especially questions about social ills and what can we do, what can I do as a clergyman to address some of the abuses that we see going on in our society. That's the kind of question that a lot of young people are dealing with today. So, although the tradition, for the historical reasons, it's focused on the law, I think that there's some movement away from a very, very narrow look at this. And the other thing is that the question of what the law is also something that comes up for discussion. So, you know, in Western newspapers, and they oftentimes condemn, they say, these Muslims, they want to introduce Shariat law. Oh my goodness, it's going to be whipping people and all kinds of other things that we don't like. And but a lot of people, their idea of Shariat is just what God wants from us, what God demands from us. So while on the one hand, there's a movement to say that, well, we need to reform how we understand what Shariat is. And maybe it's we're not going to endorse everything the way that it has been in the tradition. So there's this kind of reform movement about the law. On the other hand, there are people who say that the law is okay just the way it is, but it's not really so important. What's more important is how we address the social issues. How can we take the Masumin as guides for our life and the conditions and the challenges that face us today?
I think we have at least two other questions, but let me just make one small comment. I mean, of course, it is, if one considers the balance between law and theology in particular, then one thing which has been happening arguably since the 50s, but certainly since the late 80s, is what's known as the Kalam-e-Jadid movement, which is very much focused on both reform of law, but also has a arguably a very strong focus upon ethics in particular and upon rights. So that's happening. But at the same time, one's not necessarily finding the emergence of public theology as such. I mean, I did a bit of research just before the lockdown in Lebanon, in the Gulf, and I asked a lot of people, very prominent clergymen, so what about this role of the public theologian? What about, for example, something which is akin to Catholic social teaching, that's being put out from Shia centers? And a lot of them were basically, at times, slightly confused by that question. They were like, well, why do you need a public theologian? We have these people who are trained as fuqaha, and they are preachers as well in mosques, etc. They can perfectly well do it. But then very few of them could come up with examples of those who could do it on a range of, the really big moral issues that we have currently in the world. They just couldn't do that. It's one thing to explain a particular hukum. It's another thing to deal adequately with questions of sexuality, with questions of abortion, for example, with questions of economic justice, COVID, for example, the whole sort of range of things. It's rare to find someone who has that sort of standing.
Absolutely right. But these are also questions that perhaps there hasn't been that much that's been published on this yet, but I'm sure that there are lots of people who are discussing these issues very intensely. A couple of years ago, I had a series of discussions with Ayatollah Misbah, in which I explained to him the compendium of the social teachings of the Catholic Church. And he made responses. And in general, his response was to say, wow, they really did a tremendous work. We should be doing this kind of work as well. We should be stating what our positions are with respect. He said, of course, I'm not going to endorse what the Catholic Church has said about all of these social issues, but the fact that they were able to put this all together into a compendium is something that's really praiseworthy. And I've also taught social theology at the Donishkaya Adiyan, the Religion and Dominations University. And students were very much interested in social theology and trying to develop these kind of ideas further. And there's been a number of PhD theses written on social theology, and mostly trying to compare figures like Shahid Motahari and Shahid Sadr with social theologians in the Christian tradition.
Thank you. there is a question from Milad. Go ahead, Milad.
Yes, hi, thank you so much for this presentation. I have two questions, one quickly about the Imam Khomeini Institute. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about it. What kinds of resources does it have? What kinds of degrees does it offer? Who studies there, and how is it located in the sort of social field of knowledge production in Iran? And the second question is, I'm struck by how various predicaments that you're discussing, for example, equality that you discussed in relationship to slavery, or right now about the social compendium, or about social theology, about human rights. These are questions that are emerged from, if you will, outside of the tradition, and then there are various responses to them. And you laid out the various ways that different thinkers in a quite socially contentious way sometimes debate them. I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about this whole dynamic, not so much about various responses, but about the social historical situation where the questions are being posed to the tradition. This, to me, is a sign of let's say, an epistemological crisis. That the questions are no longer posed based on methodologies of the tradition. And of course, this produces a lot of anxieties, as you pointed out, for those who are trained in a tradition of thinking and epistemology, because they know that what is offered as knowledge is no longer being adjudicated, debated, and whatnot. So I'm wondering, what resources do you see available in ethical philosophy or in Islamic philosophy or various traditions there to think about this very situation where questions are being posed from outside of the tradition? Thank you.
Sure, thanks for the questions. With respect to the first question about the Imam Khomeini Education and Research Institute, this is a kind of elite institute connected with the with the Islamic seminaries. All the people who study at the institute have to be enrolled in the seminary system and have reached a certain degree within that system. And they have to continue doing their studies in the seminaries, while at the same time they work on studying for a degree at the institute. The institute gives PhD and MA degrees in various fields. The last time that I looked, it was something like 15 or 14 different areas: economics, psychology, education, philosophy, Quranic studies, various different kinds of fields that they can study in. But all of them have to be actively studying in the seminaries as well. And I find this a very exciting place to work, because the people who are teaching, many of them are people who have had university background. So it's not, the institute is not just like the seminaries. The professors who are teaching at the institute, at least not all of them, but many of them, have a university background. So the students who are seminary students are being exposed to the kind of ideas and teachings that one finds in the universities. And this gets to the second question that you asked about the social dynamic of the challenges and how to respond to them. I think that too much, the way that from outside it appears is like we say that, well, we got the conservative stick in the mud mullahs And then we have these Roshan Fikri types who are out to shake things up. And I think it's much, much more complex than that. The people with the traditional background also see this kind of crisis situation as an opportunity, because people aren't coming to the ulama only with the Masail. It's the questions that they're bringing are not anymore just what should I do if I forgot my prayer, and how can I make up for some other sin that I did, or something like this, or they're asking questions about social problems, about equality, about the role of women, about the future of the family in Iranian society. Where is it going? And what kind of guidance can somebody with a traditional background, somebody who is conversant with the literature from the Quran and the rivayats and the narrations, what kind of guidance can they give us on these kind of questions? So a lot of the young talibés, young people who are studying this stuff, they're eager for this because they see it as an opportunity in which they can establish the importance of the guidance that we can find within the tradition, if only we would reread it with attention towards these kinds of questions. But of course, not everybody's that way. I mean, some people are scared of the whole thing and think that it's terrible. But the people that I come into contact at the Institute and also at the university as well, most of the young people who have any kind of background in the seminary system are really interested in trying to explore new ways. I mean, once in a while you get somebody who says, you know, we've got it all nailed down and your job is just to present us the questions and we've got the answers. We've had them for a long time. But that's a kind of minority view now, I would say. Most of the people within the seminaries, they're also interested in trying to deal with these issues. But how to deal with the issues and who should take the leadership? One of the questions, one of the social questions about this, it's not exactly what position you're going to end up with about ethics and its relation to fiqh, so much as who is going to be saying what that should be. Should it be the clergy saying what that should be? Or should it be somebody who studied in the university who doesn't even know how to read Arabic? No, so, and a lot of issues, as I see them, there's a kind of culture clash between people who study English in addition to Persian and people who study Arabic in addition to Persian. And one of the goals that the Institute, the Imam Khomeini Institute had was to bring these together, was to find people who, when they give admission tests, once I went, I was invited to sit in on admission tests at the Institute. And boy, I was glad I wasn't applying because the exam was really, really hard. I mean, one of the scholars would hand a page out of a Arabic text and say to the student, read this paragraph and tell us what it means in Persian. And then I had to do the same thing. I was supposed to pick a English text from a philosophical text and give it to the poor student who had to read it on the spot and explain what it meant. And the people who were successful at that were admitted into the institute. So, but there's generally, there's still a lot of suspicion on both sides. People who are only familiar with works in English as their second language are suspicious of the ones who are trained in the traditional setting, and the ones who only know Arabic are often really suspicious of the people coming out of a university setting, which is oftentimes seen as too Western influenced.
You know, your language test reminds me of when I applied to do a PhD at Princeton, and I was faced with the same thing where every language I claimed, and I claimed a few more than I knew, I was asked by a specialist to read a couple of paragraphs, translate, and explain what's going on. So that's always quite daunting in any context. We have another question. We have a question from Professor Ibrahim Azadegan. So please do go ahead and ask the question. You're muted, I think. You're muted. I unmute you. Can you unmute yourself? Because it's... how do we do this? Are you... Oh yeah, I think that's worked. Yeah, go ahead. Oh, we can't hear you. You're unmuted, but there's no sound. I don't know why there's no sound coming. I don't know how to do this. Anyone tech savvy figure out why we can't hear him? According to this, the audio is on, but there's no sound coming. Maybe the mic's not activated or something like that. Maybe you can put your, oh yeah. Have you clicked on connect to audio? Yeah, when you enter it, you have to press connect to audio. That might be the issue. He has mentioned in the chat that he wants to ask about Islam and human rights, but what exactly he wants to ask might be the more useful, because that could be pretty much anything and everything. Yes, does it work now? No, it doesn't seem to be working at the moment. There's no sound. Maybe you can just type it in the chat, and then we can, yeah, if you put it in the chat, and then we can take it up. Shall we go to a next question while he's putting it in the chat? Anyone else have a question? Please do go ahead.
May I ask a question?
Yes, please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Legenhausen, for actually a very nice conversation. I have two questions. First, about the process of teaching philosophy of ethics in Iran. Is there, I don't know, a course just dedicated to Western philosophy of ethics, and then an Islamic philosophy of ethics, and then you compare these together? Or no, it's just one course and I don't know, you teach it comparatively? This is my first question. And the second is about the future of philosophy of ethics or moral issues in Iran. Could you please elaborate that? How do you see it in the future? Is it more related to analytic issues, or it's going to be, I don't know, more Islamic, or the most traditional approaches? Thank you.
Yeah, everything depends on the teachers. So we have some people who are teaching ethics at the university who completely are teaching in a traditional manner. So they'll teach Miskave, for example, or Naraki, even, or some of the more recent works that are coming out of that tradition. My own courses are almost entirely focused on Western metaethics. So I'm teaching a course right now in moral relativism, and the previous semester I alternate. Usually one semester I teach moral epistemology, and the other semester I teach relativism. And I'm mostly, I mean, like 90%, more than 90%, just focusing on texts in the analytic tradition dealing with these issues. But I usually try to stick in one lesson doing some comparative work, or at least showing where connections could be made between the material that I've been teaching and stuff from the tradition that students might be more familiar with, to try to instigate some interest in doing comparative work as well. And as for the future, I find it to be a very exciting time in Iran now to be teaching ethics and talking to people about these kinds of issues. There are a lot of different ideas floating around. Lots of people are very, very much interested in pursuing these questions. So as to whether it's going to become more analytic or something else, I would hope that it develops its own character, and in time, I'm sure it will. But it's hard to foresee a specific direction in that regard.
Just to add one point about the curriculum, in the bachelor curriculum, there are two separate courses. In bachelor curriculum of philosophy, there are two separate courses named ethics in the Islamic thought and ethics in the Western thought. I think these are two different and separate courses, 2 credits each one.
Yeah.
Okay.
You know, and when I first became aware of that, and it's not just in ethics, but in philosophy generally, I was really annoyed about the way that the Western stuff and the Islamic stuff is always separated. And once I had a meeting with some people at the University of Tehran when I was still living in Tehran, so more than 25 years ago. But I told them, you should try to bring these things together and do more comparative work. And then they laughed at me. They said, yeah, we need to have professors who are proficient both in Arabic and in English to do that. We don't have them. That's the problem. So it's a practical problem. There's so much of the problems that I find in misunderstanding, suspicion, on all sides. At the end of it, you find language difficulties.
Thanks. I think we can now go to Professor Azadgan.
Okay.
Hello,
yes. Dr. Legenhausen. And thank you for your time. Salam. My question is about, nice to see you here. My question is about the relation between Islam and human rights. And yeah, I think that you have some idea about this, but as you mentioned, this is not only a philosophical problem. It is a real problem in our society. Day by day, we can see the challenge between fiqh and human rights. It is very important that we have a solution to this problem. What is your idea about this? Thank you.
Yeah, this is a really complex issue. My own idea is, for a number of years, I've been studying different philosophies of human rights and the way that human rights is approached by Muslim thinkers. And I've become extremely skeptical about the foundations, philosophical foundations of human rights. What I see happening, though, in Iran is a tendency among young people, reform-minded people, people who want to criticize the society, that they take the idea of human rights as a tool on the basis of which to mount their criticism. And this, I think this is a bad strategy because the establishment is then going to respond by saying, oh, yeah, you're just basing everything on this Western notion of human rights or on the notion of human rights that you find in the UN or something like that, but we have a different notion of human rights. So then you get into this big controversy about the legitimacy of various interpretations of human rights. And I think that just sidetracks people from the kinds of issues that they're trying to address. And there's no need to put it in terms of human rights. You can put the same kind of issues in terms of justice. Nobody from the tradition is going to argue with you that you can't say that justice is needed. Everybody agrees that we need justice. It doesn't matter whether you're coming from a Western background or a traditional background or from the Jose or from the Danishka or anywhere else. So my own perspective is that it would be better to try to address social issues and problems today in terms of justice rather than in terms of human rights, which brings with it this whole panoply of other kind of issues and arguments in resistance to it.
I mean, that kind of makes me think that sometimes a lot of what happens in a modern Iranian context is trying to negotiate strategies which are going to get you the most effective outcome. I think Amber has a follow-up on this, so please do go ahead.
Hey, Muhammad, nice to see you again. Actually, this is a follow-up, coincidentally, a direct follow-up to what you were just talking about, because I was thinking as we were listening to this, whether justice might not actually be a really good kind of Schnittstelle or, point of resonance or something between kind of Anglo-American analytic traditions and Islamic ethics. And so I was glad to actually hear you say that, because that was kind of something where I thought maybe there's productive work to be done there. I'm curious about, within the context of Iranian philosophy right now, whether one justice-related topic that's a real hot topic in Anglo-American circles right now is getting any attention in Iranian circles, namely the question of epistemic injustice. So there's a lot of questions being raised right now about how moral, social, and epistemic issues are all kind of inextricably related with one another. Who gets to count as a knower? Who's knowledge, who's authoritative to speak on certain kinds of experience and who's not? And this is, of course, really important for post-colonial contexts as well. But it's coming up in all sorts of areas, whether it be kind of, feminist epistemology, philosophy of science, philosophy of religion. And so I'm curious whether you've seen any movement towards discussions of those kinds in Iran, whether you see potential for future work.
I see a lot of potential for it. It's also nice to see you, Amber. There's a lot of potential for it. I've had private discussions with people about some of these issues, but I haven't seen any publications so far specifically addressing questions of epistemic justice. But I think it's just a matter of time. These issues are circulating now, and sooner or later there's going to be publications in Persian dealing with these issues as well.
Cool. Do we have any other questions? I'm just aware that we've been going for about an hour and a half, and we've taken a lot of Professor Legenhausen's time. Are there any further questions? We can obviously hold them for longer if you wish. Mansoura has another question. Go ahead, Mansoura.
Thank you. I have a question concerning I think the most important intellectual debate in Iran, which is theories on revelation, the nature of the revelation. As you know, Shabestari, Surush, especially with his late theories on Quran, that it is only dreams of the Prophet. And you mentioned that Mesbah wrote a book, published a book on akhlaq in Quran, در Quran. Does this debate of intellectuals have an influence on the way fuqaha are discussing on these things? Because, for example, you can't forget, for example, the idea of Shabestari about the end of fiqh, and at the same time to return in a naive way to Quran and to try to develop a sort of system of moral values, because the question is, and by the way, I don't find really the new theories on Quran not very revolutionary in comparison to Sadra's theory on it. It is unbelievable that 400 years ago he had such a revolutionary idea on the revelation, the nature of revelation, and it is very clear that he says sometimes that it is not the words of that are given to Muhammad, which it is sometimes the not exactly experience, but the light and knowledge and so on. So these sort of discussion, these theories on Quran, which is very important in the whole Muslim world at the time, the Egyptian intellectual Abu Zaid and Arkun and all these people are talking about this. I wonder if the fuqaha can go back to Quran and say, well, God told us to act like this and it is the law, and our moral also should be based on these laws. Do they at all pay attention to these new discussions?
Yes, but it's been entirely negative. And I mean, people pay attention to these discussions because they consider them to be heretical, and so they write up things to refute these kind of ideas. But the whole debate about the nature of revelation and whether the words come from God or not was very hot topic, I'd say 3 or 4 years ago. But since then, it's not something that people are focusing on. And the kind of idea that that the prophet himself is making it up as he goes along, as it were, this is really, really completely rejected by the vast majority of not just the ulama, but most of the intellectuals in Iran as well. Yeah, it's an important topic, and you have people in the Sunni world as well who are questioning these kind of things, but that's not a topic that's really catching on among thinkers in Iran as far as I've seen, except to produce negative reaction and refutations of various kinds.
If I can just kind of comment on that maybe and continue that. I mean, it seems to me that there is actually a fundamental distinction between what Avicenna and Mullah Sadr are saying and what people like Soroush are saying. What Avicenna and Mullah Sadr are saying is a bit like the classic old debate between the Mu'tazila and the Ash'ari on whether the Quran was created or not. That question had very little implication for hermeneutics, in the sense that it didn't change the authority of the text, right? So the authority of the text remains regardless. It's not, Soroush and Shabastari, or the Soroush, I think more, this distinction between what is essential and what is not essential in the Quran, which you find also in people like Abu Zayd and others. That's a different kind of issue. And that, for me, I mean, I wrote a review of Soroush a long time ago, where I basically said this is the fundamental problem. How do we know from Soroush what the criteria are for distinguishing between what is essential and what is non-essential, beyond one's prejudice, perhaps, of what is essential or what is essentially divine and what is cultural. So it's a different kind of thing. And on the Avicennian account, actually, there is a wonderful, very recent habilitation dissertation by Miriam Sipti in Paris, which hopefully will be published within a year or so, which explains in great detail how revelation works according to Avicenna, which is wonderfully interesting. And actually, I mean, this is a side point, but that study convinces me that Avicenna probably was Shi'i, actually, because his theory of revelation is terribly Shi'i, and it's very, very similar to actually what Mullah Sadr says, but that's a different kind of issue altogether. But I think it raises this, this is a fundamental question, how, if we're going to talk about ethics, where do you get your ethics from, right? And of course, for a lot of people do want to get their ethics from scriptural sources. But, I kind of wonder whether Soroush is really saying we shouldn't be doing that. And even, when you meet people like Soroush or Shabastari, in their normal everyday life, I find it very dissonant in some ways with the suggestion that they're basically saying we shouldn't take these kind of moral axioms seriously if they're coming from scripture. But sorry to take that over.
If I could just make a quick comment on that, is when we look at the texts from what we find in the Quran and the Hadiths, in the Quran and the Hadiths, it's not saying that the only knowledge that we have of what's right and wrong is coming from this text. The Masumins were not saying that the only knowledge of what's just and unjust is something that has to be backed up by a textual source. But it seems that now we, as Muslims, because of Islam is so bound up with our identity, anything that we consider to be good or praiseworthy or just, we want to have it have a endorsement that can be found in our scriptures somewhere. And I think that's questionable at best.
Thank you very much. I don't know if there are any questions, but maybe we should bring this to a close. So thank you once again, Professor Muhammad Legenhausen. I'm going to stop recording.